When I ask people about the best areas in the Souls series, I might hear Central Yharnam, Medulla, Lendel, or maybe even Fountainhead Palace. However, there's one area that's genuinely considered to be in the conversation despite being a product of lower expectations in a time where there wasn't much competition, as well as being widely celebrated for its now outdated and monotonous design and aesthetics, which is evidently undeserving and only coexisting with other areas because of nostalgia and its presence in Dark Souls 1 being a widely dark and gothic game transposing into some high fantasy cringe. I need to first talk about the entire game and why I think it's generally overrated and pales in comparison to Dark Souls 2 and its successors. People are quick to hop on the notion that Dark Souls 1's second half is bad while the quote-unquote masterpiece that is the first half is the messiah of video games because you can loop back to Firelink from an elevator. Although I agree that the first Catacombs Ascent to Pinwheel is really fun and concludes in one of the only enjoyable bosses in the game, along with the Asylum being a great tutorial area, this game is genuinely bad across the board. There's no second half this or first half that, most of the areas are terrible and Anor Londo is no exception despite the high praise and constant hype that it receives, like it's the crown jewel of level design. This level is fucking horrendous. And I can't believe that millions of people have been brainwashed into thinking that this is even remotely good. So right off the bat, you're greeted with a very stimulating and majestic visual of the area's landscape and buildings, which are 99% inaccessible until 2 games later. The initial atmosphere is bright and uplifting when first arriving, making for a pleasant and welcoming change in lighting and mood as opposed to the rest of the game. But the more I played, the more repetitive and boring it becomes when I start to realise that everything looked exactly the same, lacking any substance or variety whatsoever. This is apparent very quickly because of the area's prioritisation of scale, making it less dense and less detailed simultaneously. And after one of the worst platforming sections in video game history, more of that in a minute, you're greeted to some of the most bland and dull looking interiors I've ever seen. Like, if this was a horror game, I'd have to give them credit for these cursed looking hall sections that are more representative of backroom concept art or default wall textures. Like, what the fuck were they thinking? The bricks, the staircase, the unfurnished rooms, the excessiveness of all of this is genuinely horrific and depressing to look at. All of the enemies being Silver Knights doesn't help this either, but I do sympathise with them, and I completely understand why they want to make your life just as miserable as theirs. The main hallway looks nice, but is off-putting compared to the rest of the level. The only section that is genuinely beautiful is the entrance to another level in the Painted World. Speaking of nice looking areas, the Painted World and Ashleigh completely blow Anor Londo out of the water, and it isn't even close, both of which more deserving to be in the conversation of best looking areas in the series, but are too small to compare to the streets of Yharnam or the grand open city of Lendel or the Fountainhead Palace. I'd be willing to bypass Anor Londo's blaring weaknesses in its non-congruent stylization and repetitive use of assets and environments if the level was functionally enjoyable to traverse and explore. But it isn't. In fact, it's actually the worst in the game mechanically. The platforming is unfair, the enemies are in abundance, especially the Painting Guardians, and it's not fun whatsoever. The walk across the roof is the most bullshit section in the game, and the developers liked it so much that they immediately did the same exact thing 2 minutes later. Everyone's throwing shit at you, and it's luck as to whether or not you're launched off the side of a building. These controls shouldn't allow for this type of precise platforming and manoeuvring. It's hard enough to even kick or jump in Dark Souls 1, let alone the shit that Anor Londo tries to throw at you. And concluding the best area in Souls history, we have a glorified gank boss and a chase simulator, both being apparently uplifted by nostalgia and lore, even though objectively they're 2 of the worst fights in the series again, and it's not even a coincidence at this point. I genuinely think everything about this area is abysmal, and these fights are mechanically flawed and just as boring as the rest of the level, that it really supports my theory that everyone is in on some sort of weird sarcasmic joke that Anor Londo is in fact the worst area in the game. And enough people have been brainwashed into believing it without ever taking the time to play it again for themselves without biased or an overvalued optimistic approach coming into it. There were a lot of terrible fights in this game, however. I am aware of this and don't unknowingly discredit these fights in particular because they're generally worse than Dark Souls 1's average roster. They are average, but how can you look at Artorias, Quelaag or the Goat Pinwheel and say that this shit is better in any way? I don't need to talk about Gwendolyn much because he is considered to be a substandard fight in the game that I do agree with, but I think he's more of a creative fight than Monster and Smo. He teaches you how to properly avoid projectiles as well as make you wary of the empty, never-ending halls. And Anor Londo's bland colours are an amazing medium for portraying this absolute dejection and perpetual state of turmoil through a never-ending and unfaltering boss fight. I can't really come up with anything to illustrate my hate for Ornstein and Smo further. I just think it's a disgraceful boss fight, and I'd have to label any love for this fight as illegitimate because of its unfair difficulty being a product of the time and is only because of flaws in the game's mechanics as opposed to a genuine learning curve like in Bloodborne or Sekiro. But overall, I think Anor Londo is undeserving of its constant praise. I don't think this area was ever revolutionary to begin with, nor was it ever a good addition to an already overrated game. When enough praise is given to something, people usually latch on and blindly agree whilst ignoring any negatives that are evident in their experience because they want to fit in. This is why everyone dislikes Dark Souls 2, this is why everyone likes Elden Ring even though that game is terrible, this is why everyone likes Dark Souls 1, because people thought this game was difficult over a decade ago, so its initial reputation is untarnished and immune to criticism even when warranted. Personally, I think Dark Souls 2 is the best Souls game ever made, better than Dark Souls 1 in every way. While Dark Souls 1 aged poorly, Dark Souls 2 is still relevant and just as enjoyable to play a decade later. Dark Souls 1 is not the best Souls game, it's literally the worst, but I can respect the fact that people still enjoy it in ways that I can no longer.